History is often written by the victors, the powerful, and the free. But in 1861, a voice emerged from the shadows of American history that refused to be silenced. Using the pseudonym Linda Brent, a woman named Harriet Jacobs published one of the most significant slave narratives in history. Harriet didn't just write about the physical cruelty of slavery. She pulled back the veil on the unique, psychological, and sexual terror faced by enslaved women. Her story is not just one of survival, it is a masterclass in psychological warfare and the unbreakable will of a mother. Harriet was born in 1813 in Edenton, North Carolina. For the first few years of her life, she didn't even know she was enslaved. Her parents, Daniel and Delilah, were skilled laborers who provided a relatively stable home. But the peculiar institution of the South was a monster that eventually came for its due. When Harriet was 6, her mother died. She was sent to live with her mother's mistress, Margaret Horniblow, who taught Harriet to read and sew. For a moment it seemed Harriet might be spared the worst of slavery. But when Horniblow died in 1825, Harriet was bequeathed not to freedom but to a 3-year-old niece. The executor of that estate was a man who would become Harriet's lifelong tormentor, Dr. James Norcom, referred to in her book as Dr. Flint. As Harriet entered her teenage years, Dr. Norcom began a relentless campaign of sexual harassment. He didn't just use force. He used psychological manipulation, whispering threats and filth into her ear while she worked. To escape Norcom's advances, Harriet made a heartbreakingly complex choice. She entered a consensual relationship with a white lawyer, Samuel Sawyer. She hoped that by having children with another powerful white man, Norcom would lose interest or be forced to sell her. "I knew what I did, and I did it with deliberate calculation. I would rather give myself to one than submit to the will of the other." She had 2 children, Joseph and Louisa. But Norcom did not relent. Instead, he used her children as leverage, threatening to send them to the plantation to be broken if she didn't submit. Harriet realized that as long as she was there, her children were in danger. She had to disappear. In 1835, Harriet Jacobs escaped, but she didn't run north. Not yet. She knew Norcom would watch the ports and roads. Instead, she hid in plain sight. Harriet crawled into a crawl space in the attic of her grandmother's house. This space was only 9 feet long, 7 feet wide, and at its highest point only 3 feet tall. She lived in this loophole of retreat for 7 years. Think about that. 7 years without standing upright. 7 years of stifling heat in the summer and freezing cold in the winter. Rats and insects were her only company. Why did she stay? Because from a small hole she bored into the wood, she could watch her children play in the yard below. She could hear their voices, though she couldn't call out to them. Through letters she smuggled out and had mailed from the north, she tricked Norcom into believing she had already fled to New York. In 1842, a window of opportunity finally opened. With the help of the Underground Railroad and a network of allies, Harriet escaped by boat to Philadelphia and eventually to New York City. Even in the North, she wasn't truly safe. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant that Norcom's family could legally kidnap her back into bondage. It wasn't until 1852 that her employer and friend, Cornelia Grinnell Willis, purchased Harriet's freedom, a concept Harriet detested, believing no human should have to be bought. Now legally free, Harriet began to write. Urged on by abolitionists like Amy Post, she spent years drafting her life story. Unlike Frederick Douglass, who focused on the quest for literacy and manhood, Harriet focused on the domestic sphere, the sanctity of motherhood, and the sexual exploitation of enslaved women. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl was published in 1861, right as the Civil War began. It shattered the Southern myth of the happy slave and the noble master. Harriet Jacobs spent her remaining years as a relief worker, helping Black refugees during the war and establishing schools for formerly enslaved people. She died in 1897, but her words remain.